Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members. I'm Rajia Siddiqui, a member of the MPA class of 2018, and I will play host for today's policy speaker series, for which we are fortunate to have Mr. Kevin Page here to speak with us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory Kingston sits on has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. We're grateful to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island for welcoming us to the territory. Now I would like to introduce to you Mr. Kevin Page. Mr. Page is the founding president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Prior to this position, he was a Jean-Luc Pepin Research Chair in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa from 2013 to 2016. He was Canada's first parliamentary budget officer from 2008 to 2013. He has 27 years of experience in the federal public service, with most of those years spent at 3 central agencies responsible for budgeting, including the Department of Finance, the Treasury Board Secretariat, and Privy Council Office. He was Assistant Secretary to Cabinet for Macroeconomic Policy before becoming Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer. As a Parliamentary Budget Officer, Mr. Page served a 5-year term providing Canadian parliamentarians and taxpayers with independent analysis on trends in the national economy, the state of nation's finances, and estimates of the government. Mr. Page led a small but talented team that built the first legislative budget office in Canada, one that was viewed as a leading practice among peer nations by such organizations as IMF and OECD. We're incredibly fortunate to have Mr. Page here with us today, especially amidst his recent media attention surrounding the federal government budget. Mr. Page has been quoted in many media outlets in the past week regarding the federal government's market debt, topping the $1 trillion mark for the first time. I'm sure there will be many follow-up questions from the audience today for Mr. Page's thoughts on government borrowing, and you can ask these questions using Slido. For those unfamiliar with Slido, you can submit your questions by going to the Slido website directly or using the app on your phone. The code for today is MPA 18. Please ask questions throughout the talk, and they will show on the screen here. Also, if you don't have a question, still take a moment to vote on others' questions you're also interested in. We will also take a few questions live from the crowd today. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Mr. Kevin Page.
Good morning, good afternoon. Sorry, just take a second here. It's great to be back here in Kingston. I was thinking, I was driving from Ottawa, and it obviously brings back memories. I was here about 40 years ago, maybe just a little less than 40 years ago, and pretty formative time. Like when I look back at spending time here, and of course I look at all these young faces, and I thank the students, actually particularly the students, for inviting me here to come speak. But obviously you can't help but reminisce, those times. It was around 1980 plus or minus. I was here doing a master's degree, and thinking back, just kind of how things have changed as well, but just like the experience alone, going to school, doing a master's program here, and just actually looking around the room and seeing these names like Hershane and Banting and Milligan, and I was saying this is reminiscent to me of like watching the Montreal Canadiens in the 1970s, all these superstar kind of players, and their names are still pretty fresh for most people, do the kind of work that I do. But I remember, actually, I still have strong memories from Kingston. People talk of formative years, so, obviously hard work, like the professors putting a lot of pressure on you and all the pressures of papers and passing and things of that nature. But I think I remember being inspired by some of the professors I had, and just the issues of the day, which are fundamentally different. They change. Obviously, context changes. The issues of the day, like around that period, 1980, where like we had these, oil price shocks, and people were talking about stagflation and Phillips curves and these sorts of big issues. And it'd be hard for looking at some of the students to think about inflation that was 12 or 13%. Our unemployment rate 12, 13%, interest rates 15, 16%, people trying to buy homes in that type of environment, significant recessions, but like inflation being the big issue of the day for a lot of macroeconomists. And also, remember that a lot of the people that I ended up working for when I went, started at Department of Finance, were actually like former graduate students, from Queens. So this tradition of Queens was incredibly strong. I think probably the most important thing I got out of Queens was my wife. To be totally honest, we got engaged not very far from here. Popped the question down by Lake Ontario, and we were living in Sin at the time. I forgot the cameras on. I should probably. But and that, again, in terms of times changing, actually to come from a Polish Ukrainian parent, a Catholic family, and then be shacked up with your wife on Yonge Street and going to school, getting a graduate degree. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a very good sin. We're still married. The better part of 40 years later, and very happy. So, but again, most importantly, the inspiration. I really do remember that. I remember the professors as if it was yesterday. I mean, I think Professor Lipsy and Purvis and Harris, and there are all these issues that were playing out. It could be these big macroeconomic issues, or it could be oil price issues, and these professors were writing constantly. They were engaged. They were putting pieces in the Financial Post at the time, and I remember going to their classes and literally reading their articles, and they were totally engaged, in this stuff. And I don't think I ever lost that sense of that connectivity. And I know, I spoke to Professor Dr. Walker here, that tradition of Queens wanting to be involved in these big issues of the day, knowing that Professor Kershane is still working on Indigenous issues, and everybody's looking forward to his book. So that tradition lives on, and that becomes so important. So I thought, like you said, a mixed crowd here, and it's true, in the last week or so, people were asking me a lot of questions about debt. Should we really be worried about debt? Actually, on the way here, I stopped at I pulled off to the side of the road to get a coffee and go to use the washroom in one of those en route places, and a fellow recognized me. He said, "Kevin, I want to talk to you about, the budget." And he said, I remember Mr. Krachin. Mr. Krachin said, if the interest rates are low, we should, the government should be out there spending money. And why should we get the economy going? And he was telling me about all the various projects that are going on in the construction industry. And I guess what I took away from that is it's really nice to know that people are engaged on these issues. But, three things I want to try to connect the dots on. Number one was just an article I read first thing this morning. You get up, make the coffee, sit down, open up the iPad, read the New York Times, and there's a piece written by Tom Friedman. I just want to connect a dot there. But he used this term, we're heading into the second inning. And, this is baseball time. Blue Jays are on TV on the weekend. That kind of resonated with me. But he wasn't really talking about baseball. He was talking about Zuckerberg, and he was talking about what's going on in the States and technology and Uber and these sorts of things, and this great transformation that seems to be taking place. And really, where is the moral leadership on some of these files? And so that really kind of inspired me. Again, not exactly a federal debt discussion, market debt, Crown Corporation debt, effective interest rates, et cetera, but a really important issue. And then the second issue I just want to talk about is skin in the game. So actually, I even brought the book with me. On Thursday, I was headed out to go to Concordia. I spent, I was lucky enough to spend the full day with graduate students at Concordia on Friday. And I was actually asked before I headed out, there's a fellow named Murray Brewster. Murray Brewster is a writer, he's a journalist for CBC. He mostly known for defense issues. When I was in the Parliamentary Budget Office, we got involved in defense issues, fighter planes and ships. Governments was trying to do a lot of procurement. There are big costing issues. So I had developed this relationship with Murray. But Murray, or Mr. Brewster, he wanted to talk about debt. He was really the person behind creating this story that we're kind of busting through a certain debt level. And what's behind this? And you got to help me understand these numbers, interest-bearing debt, market debt, Crown Corporation debt. How does this, should we be worried about this? Is $1 trillion a lot for market debt, borrowing bills, and these sorts of things? So, as I was going to the CBC building, I did the interview. Even at the end of the interview, I'll get back to some of these issues around the budget, et cetera. But Murray says, how do we communicate this stuff? How do we tell Canadians, does anybody really care? Should we care? Federal deficit, roughly 1 percentage point of GDP, 18, 19, $20 billion in that kind of range. A bunch of other financial requirements for crowns, et cetera, pensions, and and debt moving up, but still seems relatively modest to other countries. He was literally saying to me, how do we sell the story? Like, how do I communicate this? He said, like literally being at the end of this interview, he said, I don't know if the National's going to take this. They're not really keen on this story around debt. So, we talked a little bit about that. So I want to get into this, like this idea of skin in the game, because when I was talking to Mr. Brewster, he's mostly a military procurement person. He really felt like he had agency, he had skin in the game. He was really interested in this issue. He wanted to understand it. And like this, on the way back from CBC, actually, I stopped at this bookstore on Bank Street, about to get on the Jeep and head to the train station, and I picked up this book from Nassim Taleb, this, is the writer of The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile, and these other books, and he's a kind of a deep thinker, one of these people that kind of talks a lot about risk and how we understand risk. And the title of the book was Skin in the Game. And like, again, and why, and when you have that skin in the game, if you could find that higher purpose, this is really kind of a message to the students really that are interested in public policy, it changes everything. Like when you really feel connected to an issue where that, it changes the way you frame an issue and the way you think about an issue. And then, lastly, I just want to make a point, which kind of, I think Friedman made it as well. In his article this morning about Zuckerberg and company, it does matter how you play the game. Like, it does really matter. It's not just about winning and losing. Often, like, when we turn on CNN, it's Donald Trump. It's always about winning and losing. If somebody's a loser, somebody's a winner. But I think the lesson I got, literally having left this place for the better part of 40 years and going into public service, and then, working as a public servant and working as, somebody that worked to support Parliament. We have Speaker Milligan here as well. It does matter how you play the game. Like, and I think it becomes fundamental to bringing about change. So, second inning. So, like in the piece this morning from Friedman, he was really talking about, like, he said, like, the first inning was all about, and he wrote this book, Thank You for Being Late, which really talks about like the global economy and how things are speeding up. And a lot of economists, we have some economists in the room, they kind of saw that in the 2008 financial crisis. Like, just, they couldn't believe how fast a housing bubble kind of spread across the world. In Tom Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, he talks about these technologies that connect people, in a fundamentally different, in a different way. And, he says the first inning was really about creating these technologies of connectivity. In financial markets, in social, in communities and social networks. And now he says, he sees this issue like Zuckerberg going in front of potentially Congress or somebody from Facebook, and now the issues are fundamentally flipped around. What happened in that election? How is it that all this information from Facebook got in the hands of nefarious people and was being used in nefarious ways? So, like, in the sense that, the technologies, and again, listening to the news on the way home from work last night, they're talking about Brexit and how that election was impacted, effectively often using this type of information. So he goes on to talk about, he says, so like the second inning, and there's this picture of Zuckerberg in a Wired magazine, kind of all scarred up. He's using the metaphor, of Zuckerberg taking like a high fastball on the inside. And really need to rethink, what is the role of the skin and moral leadership in this kind of context? But then there's this book I read at Christmas time by Harari, Homo Deus, I think it was called. And he talked a bit about like the fundamental changes your generation, the young generation, the student generation are going to have to deal with, which are very different than my generation. Like my generation, I come into Queens, I'm living on Yonge Street, I'm shacked up with my wife. That was revolutionary, right? Like, whoa, what are you doing here? Okay, Roman Catholic mother, all these sorts of things, right? So this professor from Hebrew University, Yuval Noah Harari, says, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. He talks about some of these fundamental changes. Number one, he says, and he raises them as questions. I love these questions. He says, what will happen to the job market once artificial intelligence outperforms humans in most cognitive tasks? Like, even in my generation, I could see when you go to the stores and you're scanning things through, or even the story, actually, the Friedman story, his first paragraph, he says, there's so much to talk about. I'm going to talk about that Uber driver, that self-driving that killed somebody. Because that's going to, there, he says, you could see the changes of technology having on people. So this, his first question from from Professor Harari is, what will happen to the job market once artificial intelligence outperforms humans in most cognitive tasks? I met a young lady here studying labor economics in a graduate program going to finance, which sounded a bit familiar to me. Looking number 2, he says, what will be the political impact of a massive new class of economic, this is his words, less useful people? Like, how do you deal with this massive inequality that we fundamentally know it's going to happen? How do we deal with these issues? You know, we have Professor Cushing still working in his career, like looking at indigenous issues where we have enormous gaps. Like I'm, listening to Anna Marie Tremonti on the way here, and she's talking about just like, how this portrays itself in our correctional services system. They were talking about women and the percentage of, of women, Aboriginal women that are actually in these facilities, which is skyrocketing. What will happen to relationships, families, and pension funds when nanotechnology and regenerative medicines turns 80 into the new 50? 80 into the new 50. Like the length of life is so much, it's been extended by such a great period. How are we going to deal with that? There's a budget, there's a lockup, I'm sure in Toronto right now about the Ontario budget, talking about healthcare issues, family care issues. You're running, again, another big debt issue in Ontario. What are you going to do with all that debt? The government promising everything kind of going into an election in order to win. Another last one. What will happen to human society when biotechnology enables us to have designer babies and open unprecedented gaps between the rich and the poor? These are sort of 21st century issues that, when I was here at Queen's, this thing would have been like total science fiction. It's a bit science fiction right now, but you could see that, the light, so to speak, at the end of the tunnel. So these fundamental questions you're going to deal with. One of my bosses, I don't think he went to Queen's, Alex Himmelfarb. He was a clerk. I worked for Alex when he was at I was at the Privy Council office. And I found myself, we were teaching public finance to public servants, certain aspects of costing and things like that. And I brought in Mr. Himmelfarb to talk about transitions. Like, well, how does power pass in our system? Like, because he's experienced through different types of governments. And actually, Alex went on, and he was pontificating a little bit about how he's just worried about society right now. And he quoted something which I went and tracked down from this book called Prison Notebooks from Antonio Gramsci. And he kind of says, this is my sense of the world right now, which is kind of a Tom Friedman sense of the world. The crisis consists, this is Gramsci, who wrote, this is 1920s. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So there's this sense, like Alex would go on and say, we're in between these sort of paradigms. It's not a comfortable place, but in this not comfortable place, you see this nefarious behavior. You get President Trump-like characters. That's the point that he was making. You can get Putin-esque style behaviors. And so, again, we look at this world right now, it's probably the worst time in the world to have leaders like that. With all this political uncertainty, particularly out of Russia, North Korea, just Brexit taking place. So we're in the first inning. The first inning's coming to close. Now we're moving into the second inning. And then the question really will be the kind of leadership that we get, I think from the generation of students that's here today that has to deal with these incredibly tough issues. And we hope, obviously that, coming out of schools like this, that you'd be willing to take on these issues. So that leads me to this other issue, like the skin in the game, the Nassim kind of Taylor point. Like, what will it take to get, students at Queen's? I was at Concordia last week, a couple weeks ago I was at McGill, to get them completely involved in these issues so that you're completely invested, on these big issues. And for me, my experience, obviously, probably the reason I'm here was the Parliamentary Budget Office. Otherwise you probably wouldn't have known me. If you're a bureaucrat and you work in finance or the Treasury Board or the Privy Council office, there's, it's a great career, interesting. I got to work with amazing people. It felt completely fulfilling. But it kind of was like somehow somebody pushes you into a position, and all of a sudden, okay, you have an opportunity to build something potentially new for the country. What do you do? And what did that feel like? Is there any advice, not even advice that would be too strong for me, but lessons learned, observations I can make about that experience, that as you folks go forward into your careers and you're dealing with these issues that Harari's talking about or Friedman is talking about, can you make a difference? And one for me, like again, as I've said in other places, nobody wanted to be the parliamentary budget office. Parliamentary budget officer, really in that kind of first position for all kinds of reasons. And it was unclear like whether they really wanted to even have a qualified person, whatever that means. I think that's still going to be an issue on the replacement, the parliamentary budget officer right now. So again, can you see like that opportunity when of starting something new, and what will it take and how will you play it? And I guess I could say that like I didn't want the job. Honestly, nobody wanted to be. I didn't want it. But I knew that there was an opportunity there. Like I knew from just watching colleagues in the United States, and one of my, when I was an economist at the Department of Finance, I worked for another Queens person, Don Drummond, who I think probably a lot of you know. One of my jobs was forecasting the U.S. economy, working for Don, and Don would send me from time to these conferences in Washington because again, you're forecasting. This is where a lot of public policy is being made, and I got to see what a strong institution could look like, Congressional Budget Office in the States. Like for me, then it was said like, whoa, wouldn't it be amazing to have independent people providing an analysis like that, putting their names on it, dealing with the biggest issues of the day that the government or the executive is taking to Congress or Congress was pushing in its budgets. So like I always knew that would be an opportunity. Could you make something like that fit in Canada? That was like less clear to me. It wasn't completely naive in knowing that if you were to do that in that environment, if you were to give the same information like to parliamentarians as we were giving prime ministers and finance ministers on risk around the economy, on like the full costing of issues, that it was going to be incredibly disruptive. And then, actually, getting back to the Queen's connection, my first few hires were Queen's people. Just, not that, just sort of happened that way. One of my students, or not one of my, actually I used to mark papers for a professor, Mustafa Askari, was just finishing his PhD at Queen's. Mustafa played a big role in forecasting at the Department of Finance. I kind of worked with Mustafa those years. He was the first hire. Really, he set up the shop on economic analysis and forecasting at the PBO. He had ran it at finance for many years. You can't get better person than that. Really, the second big hire was a fellow named Sahir Khan, who did his commerce degree here, then went on to do an MBA at Columbia. So again, and then probably one of the additional hires was Chris Mateer, another graduate student from Queens, who also was running forecasting at finance for many years. So it ended up, pretty quickly, we actually had a Queens team, even though we really were like cognizant of it. But it was just like and then again, you surround yourself with these sort of people that know we have opportunity. And whatever it takes, we're going to try to push this thing forward. So putting that analysis out and challenging the government, I wasn't ready for that. I think even our team, we didn't know really what that would feel like. And like that story, first report was costing a war. What was it costing literally, like the taxpayers? Not as like it was just a number, but actually to send people to Afghanistan, to have military equipment in Afghanistan, to be doing economic development in Afghanistan. And then realizing with every product that you put out, whether it's a war costing, we did other work obviously, there's this opportunity to open up the books of the government. So you take an issue like costing of a war, troops on the ground, what does that cost? But also like the cost of the military in terms of equipment, but what's the cost of disability, death and disability? What is the cost of aid that may not be effective? So opening up a conversation maybe in 2008 on disability and soldiers, for this type of perspective. I think in those kinds of opportunities, like skin in the game is trying to find a higher purpose that's kind of bigger than yourself. I don't think you take those jobs if you're worried about your career. You wouldn't become parliamentary budget officer. You wouldn't be dealing with any of these issues probably that Harari's talking about. You probably wouldn't want to be Zuckerberg today. Maybe you wouldn't mind being Zuckerberg when he was in that film a few years ago, but to be today and be talking about bringing down elections and these sorts of issues, maybe not such a good place. But actually finding a higher purpose, and what could that be? Like actually giving Canadians, giving parliamentarians information they've never seen before. I think for us at PBO, that was the skin in the game. And I think, in the budget issues that have circulated, more recently, now you kind of look at, we have, the government tabled its third budget. Obviously, polling numbers for the Liberal government are falling fairly dramatically, have fallen over the past year. They've run into some tough issues. Governments are running deficits. We have fairly significant deficit at a provincial level in Ontario. The federal government deficit, by some, may not look so large. But then the question is, okay, why are we running deficits when the economy is so strong? Why, with the economy growing at 3%, the unemployment rate below 6%, why are we running $20 billion deficits in Canada? What does this next generation in this room get for that? I think, to me, that's a question. And, when I read these budgetary documents, the last document, 370-page document, all the fiscal and economic tables are in the annex. Almost all the discussion that was in the news was really in the last 5 or 10 pages on debt management. So when people are asking me questions, why do we care about debt? Why do we care about interest on the public debt? I said, well, actually now, even, the fastest growing spending component in the budget is interest on the public debt. So the government is out there saying we put billions of dollars more into the middle class through a child program. We're putting another $3, $4, $5 billion annually into infrastructure. Well, in a few years' time, the interest cost on the public debt will be going up on an annual basis by an additional $7 or $8 billion. So here you are putting this money in with this hand, but you see interest on the public debt is growing. And then they say, well, government has a target. It's debt relative to income, and 5 years out, the debt to income ratio is actually falling. And they say, well, isn't that a good target? No, it's not a good target. Government doesn't control the denominator. I was there all the way back in 1980 when I left Queens, and I was there. We were producing these projections. Hate to say it, but Drummond and all the rest of those great economists, Mr. David Dodge was there as well, and we were all projecting stable debt to GDP ratios. It skyrocketed through the 80s and the early 90s after we got hit with a significant recession early in the early 1980s. And again, the government's saying, no, it's a perfectly viable target. Well, the government, we've added 2008, the stock of debt was roughly about $460 billion, the accumulated deficit. There's different measures. The Conservative government added about, on top of that 460, about 150 since 2008 to that stock of debt. Now this current government, even with their very different economy, and kudos to the Liberals for their stronger economy, they're saying we could add another $100 billion to that stock of debt over the next 5 years up to 2022, 23. And they're saying that there's really no cost to it. But I think actually we know that there will be a cost to it. We could see it on interest on the public debt. And then the government will always present the numbers in the best way. They'll look for, they'll look for numbers, the concepts around net debt or whatever, and then they'll compare it with other countries and say we look well. You could easily, students in this class here can easily go to IMF documents and say, well, let's look at gross liabilities. Let's compare let's look not just at the federal level, but let's add the provinces and the municipalities. What does that debt look like? And then they say, all of a sudden, the ratios don't look so favorable. Right? Actually, there's really no difference between debt at a gross level, all governments, and on average numbers for the EU right now. And so, again, what are we doing? Are we helping the next generation? And then there's these, we used to study back in stabilization policy back in the 1980s. We talk about these golden rules. Even back at Keynes 100 plus years ago, he would say, when the times are good, you should be paying down the debt. When times are difficult, like in 2008, the government should be help stabilizing this unstable economy. But the golden rule right now should be if there's any deficit right now, we should be able to point to at least longer term infrastructure investments. And you won't see that in any of the government documents. Again, which I think are pretty much gutted of analysis. There's no analysis of what is operational and what is really capital. So if we're running deficits, it's mostly for current consumption. What are we leaving behind for the next generation? Then I'll just kind of close on this when we open up on questions. I think, since being the parliamentary budget officer, I had an opportunity to work in universities and actually did do different work in different parts of the world. And just to see, which I think has been quite valuable to me, go to places like Myanmar or South Africa. I've been to South Africa many times. When I was in South Africa, on one of these occasions, they said, they gave me Mr. Mandela's book, and you said you need to read this book. And a chapter or two in, and you're hearing about how difficult, the struggle of apartheid in South Africa, and then you're hearing the lessons from Mr. Mandela, which even though he's passed, people continue to repeat. And his line was, "You never dishonor. You never dishonor your opponents. You show respect." And again, I think in the context of bringing about change in some of these difficult files, like you heard talking about on income inequality files, climate change issues. You're going to be, we're going to need students that are prepared to challenge, the current ways of thinking. So then, can you do it in a way that's entirely respectful? Respectful, of these great institutions. And I don't think you have a choice. I think, so that I just sort of leave you with that. So thank you very much. I look forward to the questions. Thank you.